If you are an anxious person, you are afraid of one thing. You are afraid of how you feel, and that's it. I used to have the worst anxiety problem ever, or at least it felt that way to me, and it made me afraid of pretty much everything. Here's a short list of things that I used to be afraid of. Being the first person to open a new container of orange juice or open maybe a new bottle of Tylenol. I used to be afraid to be home alone for even a couple of minutes. I was afraid to leave my house. I was afraid to drive. I was afraid to go too far from my house. I was afraid of any change that I could notice in my body. I was afraid of my own heartbeat. I was afraid of my own breathing. I was afraid of my own thoughts. I was afraid when the sun would go behind a cloud and the light would change. I was afraid when I would get too warm or too hot. I was afraid when I noticed any sort of pain in my body. I was afraid whenever my phone would ring. I was afraid whenever somebody would say something that referenced the word death or the topic of death and dying. I could go on, but you get the idea. Here's the thing. And I say this as a person who no longer has an anxiety problem like that anymore. And as an actual anxiety therapist who specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders, in the end, that was all just one fear. If you are an anxious person, you are afraid of one thing. You are afraid of how you feel, and that's it. This is the difference between an anxiety disorder and sort of regular anxiety, the kind of anxiety that every human being is going to experience from time to time, just as part of being alive. For a person who does not have an anxiety disorder, and by anxiety disorder, I mean things like panic disorder or agoraphobia or health anxiety or social anxiety or OCD, even though it's not officially an anxiety disorder, it's close enough that we'll lump it in. People who do not have that sort of problem, who experience anxiety, tend to experience anxiety that's externally generated. They are anxious because there is a because. Work is difficult. There's money problems. There's relationship problems. They're sick. They're just not happy with their lives. The kids are driving them crazy. Their favorite sports team just lost in the NFL playoffs. It doesn't matter. Like, anxious feelings are attributed to something that's going on outside of them. They're having a hard time handling the things that are happening in their lives. That is a very normal, expected, common human experience. We all have to go through that from time to time. In an anxiety disorder, we say that we are anxious, therefore, meaning the state of being anxious itself becomes the problem. So when we see that anxious people, like I used to be, develop this long list of things that they are suddenly afraid of, in the end, they're really afraid of only one thing, and that is how they feel. Because all of those random thoughts, like what if the orange juice is poisoned, or if I'm home alone and something happens to me, who will save me, are normal thoughts that every human brain will make from time to time. Just that when a non-anxious, non-disordered person has a thought like that, it comes and it goes. It carries no emotional wallop. There's no fear that comes with that. There's no change in bodily state or affect that goes with that. So that person can see it simply as a thought. They let it come and go. There's no consequence there. They don't get stuck to it. And for an anxious person who is dealing with an anxiety disorder, like I used to have, that thought comes with a big emotional hit that we tend to call fear or anxiety. When I have a thought like that, I notice a corresponding change in my body. My heart starts to race. I get a little bit off balance. I get depersonalized. My stomach starts to do flips. My legs get weak, whatever it happens to be for you. And that change in affect, our physical state, the way we feel, comes along with an experience that we would call anxiety or fear. And that means that the thought, what if this Tylenol has been poisoned? Or what if the orange juice is poisoned? Or what if I have a heart attack and need help and nobody's home? Or what if I drive on the Long Island Expressway and lose control of myself and crash the car? That thought suddenly feels very important and accurate, like it's a prediction, like there really is something wrong that I need to be aware of. Because the response that my body makes to that thought and the corresponding experience that I would label fear or anxiety, or you might label if you have that problem, fools us into thinking that the thought is an actual danger. But really, it's actually how we feel that becomes the source of the danger. Because if you have a friend who does not suffer from an anxiety disorder, and that friend says, oh yeah, I have crazy thoughts like that all the time, I just don't let them bother me, they come and they go, you might think, how the heck does that person do that? Well, they do that because the thought does not come with a big wallop of emotion that we would call fear or anxiety or apprehension or feelings of vulnerability. So they don't get tricked into thinking that that fear is actually true, or the thought might come true, or they are going to have a psychotic break, or they might make a scene, or they might try to open the plane door and jump out at 35,000 feet. When that non-anxious or regularly, normally anxious person has a thought like that, they can dismiss it because it's meaningless to them. But when a person with an anxiety disorder has a thought like that, and it comes with a big old hit of adrenaline and cortisol, and your body starts to respond, and then you start to have an experience inside of you that you would call fear, then you start to think like, oh, I might actually open the door of the plane and jump out at 35,000 feet. Or I might panic so much on this flight that I'm going to start pounding the cockpit door and the air marshals are going to have to duct tape me to my seat. Or I might crash my car while I'm driving. Or I might actually harm my family because I had a thought, what if I were to snap and harm my family? In anxiety disorders, the most outlandish, outrageous, irrational, not based in reality fears start to feel like they're reasonable. That might actually happen, and I need to do something to protect myself from that. And it will trick the disordered person, like I used to be, into thinking that they have this very long list of things that they have become afraid of. But in the end, they have really only become afraid of one thing, and that is how they feel. If we are working with people who have anxiety disorders, and this is what I do for a living, like I said, I'm an anxiety specialist. I treat people with anxiety disorders all day long. They will tend to walk into a therapist's office like mine and say, oh my goodness, I've learned to be afraid of everything. Or like, my list of anxiety triggers is so long and it's getting longer. How am I supposed to tackle that? And they may hear, well, we're going to face and accept and float and tolerate and face our fears and go toward our fears, run toward our fears. We're going to do exposures. We're going to expose ourselves, exposure therapy. And they will get tricked into thinking, well, I have to do all these like facing exercises and exposure therapy exercises for this long list of 32 things that I am afraid of. How do I do exposure for death? How do I do exposure for insanity? How do I do exposure for a heart attack? How do I do exposure for jumping out of a plane at 35,000 feet against my will? How do I do exposure for harm thoughts or self-harm thoughts? How do I do exposure for like sexual orientation thoughts or sexual or taboo thoughts? It's not really like that. The actual fear that you think you have, that long list of fears, each one of those is actually just a trigger. The trigger just makes the thing that you actually fear, which is the internal state that you experience when you have that thought. It's actually a little better than most people think. You do not have to solve 35 different triggers and fears. You really only have to solve one. And that is, I have to get better at learning to have these difficult internal feelings. I have to learn to allow myself to become afraid in the absence of actual danger. Even though the internal state will trick you into thinking there is danger, we are all in agreement that there isn't. It just feels that way. And even the most disordered person will say, it just feels so real. I know there's no danger, but it feels like there is. Why can't I get that? Well, because you're being tricked by this big old like flood of adrenaline and cortisol and all those big feelings that come with that and the doubt that it will create. So they will start to wonder, like, how am I supposed to handle all of that? Well, in the end, what we're really trying to solve is I have to start to treat my own body and mind as my friends again, even though sometimes they are designed to do things that are really uncomfortable in the face of what is perceived by my brain accidentally and incorrectly as a threat. I have to learn that that's kind of normal. That's going to happen sometimes. There's not much that I can really do about that once it starts to happen, because when I fear how I feel and I start to worry about all the possible triggers and the list gets longer and longer, then I am always on guard against those triggers. I'm always trying to manage that, control that, avoid that, engineer my life to never encounter one of those triggers, because I can't possibly allow that horrible feeling that confirms the scary thing that is stuck in my head right now. But that's not true. We have to recognize that if we are trying really hard to not be afraid, to not have a thought, to not have a feeling, we are almost guaranteed to have the very thought, feeling, and internal experience that we fear so much and try to avoid. Because when you try to go down the road of using control and management strategies, how many people watching this or listening to this today have spent so much time trying to figure out how to manage their anxiety or control their anxiety or regulate their nervous systems or regulate their endocrine systems to not feel those big wallops of adrenaline and cortisol and discomfort that come along with the scary things. That doesn't really work, because when we're trying to control, then we are entering into what I like to refer to as a checking state. Is the control working? How do I feel now? How do I feel now? How do I feel now? Is it working? Do I feel okay now? Is it coming? Is there any sign of this scary thing? My heartbeat, my breath, do I feel off balance? Did I just have a thought about harming my family? It becomes impossible to control it when you want to control it, because the checking state, how am I doing with control, will kick in. And now you're automatically in an elevated state of hypersensitivity and hypervigilance. And lo and behold, you wind up exactly where you don't want to be. So in the end, we have to learn, well, I got to kind of abandon that sort of strategy and understand that what's happening here is there is a natural designed into me process that's just being triggered at the wrong time. It's just happening when it's not supposed to. That's not a defect or a structural defect. That's just a mistake. It's an associative mistake. My brain has made connections that don't belong. My brain is filling in the blanks with logic gone awry and telling stories that seem plausible but aren't true. And so I have to feed it new experiences and new data so that it can undo those connections and stop doing that. When we take that tact, we start to understand that, like, even though at the height of a panic attack, or when, an OCD thought storm is like overwhelming you and convincing you that something is really horrible, it's still going to be okay. You can get through that. You do not have to fix that. You don't have to fight that. And in the end, when we learn to be a little bit better at experiencing ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, we no longer fear ourselves. And then that one fear that drives the anxious, disordered state tends to fade into the background. That is the trick. That's why we really only have to solve the one fear. And by solve, I mean not knock it down or stop it from happening. We have to actually go through the thing that we fear, which is that internal state that we try so hard to never experience. And when we get better and better at going through that internal state without taking evasive, emergency, fixing, saving action, well, we learn, hey, I thought I would never be able to handle that. Or I thought that those feelings confirmed that my thought is really true. Or I thought that those feelings confirmed that I really was dying, or really going crazy, or really about to lose control. And as it turns out, that was never true. Those are just really difficult feelings and big giant spikes of fear and uncertainty and doubt that tricked me into taking evasive action. But hey, now I start to see that that evasive action was kind of ruining my life when I thought it would make me better. It's actually making me worse. So what I want to kind of wrap up with here today, because I want to keep this around 15 minutes, is I want you to recognize that even though you might think, as an anxious person dealing with an anxiety disorder, that you have this giant list of fears and triggers that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, in the end, you really only have one fear. The triggers are sort of irrelevant, because the triggers always trigger the same thing. Take a second and think about it. Maybe a thing that's triggering to you today wasn't triggering to you 3 or 4 months ago, or 6 months ago, or a year ago, or even last week, but somehow it's triggering today. People who get really fixated on their anxiety symptoms will say, I used to be terrified of my breath. I had air hunger all the time. Now I don't care about that. Now I'm just worried about this dizzy feeling, or now I'm just worried about my stomach, or now I'm just worried about DPDR, depersonalization and derealization. People with OCD or health anxiety will say that the fixation has kind of morphed over time. I used to be afraid of this kind of thought or this particular health problem, and now I'm not anymore. Now I'm afraid of this particular thought or that kind of health problem. It has changed over time. But if you look, no matter how wide the range of triggers or thoughts might be, it always winds up with the exact same experience, which is I am agitated. I feel doubt. I feel fear. My body is amped up. The chemistry is set off, and now I feel this crazy sense of agitation, and like fight or flight has been activated. So no matter what the trigger, you always wind up in the same place. A really bad feeling that you feel like you cannot handle, cannot tolerate, because it confirms that your fear is true. So it's the feeling. It's the internal experience. How you feel is the only thing you have learned to fear. So in the end, that's why when we work with anxiety disorders, people like me work with anxiety disorders, we target that process, not the fear itself. So those of you who are watching, been hanging around The Anxious Truth long enough, will often ask questions like, but can you do a video about fear of being stuck in a traffic jam, or fear of going crazy, or fear of being on a plane, or fear of eating different foods, or fear of taking medication, even aspirin or antibiotics? Everybody wants a big, long discussion about the specific trigger, but in the end, you really want to pay attention to the process that's behind that trigger. No matter what your trigger is, you always wind up in the same place. So people like me, we're here to try to teach you Focus on that. Focus on the thing that comes after the trigger, the racing heart, the physical sensations, the crazy stream of like catastrophic thoughts to come at you like a fire hose. We are looking for that. All of your fears are one fear. That's actually good news. That's not invalidating. That's not pretending that you're not afraid. I know you are genuinely afraid, just like I used to be. So we're not trying to pretend that we're not afraid. We're not trying to control the fear and never be afraid. We're not trying to control our nervous systems and make sure they never fire off. We're not trying to heal anything. We're trying to learn that the story that your brain has constructed around that complex arrangement of thoughts and external triggers and internal physical sensation and beliefs and emotions and culture and experiences, that constructed story turns out to be wrong. And that's what we have to learn. That's good news, because if we target the one process that's underneath all of those triggers and all of those seeming fears, we can make progress. Now, that's a big ask, because it means that we do not try to learn to not be afraid of a new bottle of Tylenol or a new, carton of orange juice or being home for 5 minutes. We have to learn to be okay, even when we feel incredibly uncomfortable and afraid in the absence of an actual threat. Just a quick clarification. None of this is about learning to tolerate, float through, or expose yourself to actual danger. We can do this, and we can use this type of framework that I'm giving you today because we have decades and decades of a track record here that says that we are not walking people into disaster again and again and again. Anxiety therapists who use acceptance and mindfulness and exposure techniques like I do not leave a pile of wreckage because we tell people to go toward the thing they fear. The fears keep coming true because they risk it. They should have done it. That's not the way this works. We're really just trying to learn to be better at feeling anxious and feeling afraid. And then we don't have to worry about feeling those things. And as a happy secondary effect, tends to get triggered and appear much and much less. So a little bit of a different episode this week, very informal, just turned on the camera, talked, no script, no notes. I'm winging it off the top of my head, no production values. That's the way it's going to be. I'm going to try and keep these a little bit shorter, maybe 15 to 20 minutes going forward. Hopefully this has been helpful. Try to keep that in mind. If you're feeling overwhelmed because you feel like you're afraid of everything right now, keep in mind that you're probably really only afraid of one thing, and that is how you feel, and we can work on that, right? So thanks for hanging out today. Appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button if you really like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. That helps YouTube know that you like when I make these videos. Instead of burying me, they might actually show them to other people. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. I will be back in 2 weeks with another topic. Don't know what it is, but I'll be here. Take a little step closer toward what you want today and away from what you fear today, meaning your own body and mind. And all of those little steps will add up. I promise. It's possible. Be patient. Little steps will add up to big steps in the end. See you next time.